freedom of speech in the Vietnam War era. There was an explosion of free speech in the 1960s. There were demonstrations, there was rallies, there were protests, there were civil rights protests, there was Vietnam War protests, there was women's rights protests, gay rights protests. There was basically a revolution in free expression. As support for the Vietnam War decreased, men burned draft cards to protest. Congress passed a law to prevent the destruction of these government-issued documents. So this led to the United States versus Obrien. In this case, David O'Brien burned his draft card in front of a Boston courthouse and was convicted under the Selective Service Act, prohibited willful destruction of draft cards. O'Brien appealed to the Supreme Court, arguing it was symbolic speech that the government could not infringe. The court upheld his conviction and sided with the government's right to prevent this behavior in order to protect Congress's authority to raise and support an army. So again, the freedom of speech was declined in the government's right to prevent this action to support and raise an army. So this is another case like with Schneck, where your right is not absolute. It's limited in wartime and when there is an act for a draft. Another symbolic speech case was Cohen versus California, 1968. Paul Robert Cohen wore a jacket with F the draft while walking into an LA courthouse. He was arrested and convicted for disturbing the peace by offensive conduct. The court declared the state could not prosecute Cohen for this expression because the phrase on the jacket in no way incited an illegal action. So this was a case where symbolic speech was allowed, and it was one because it had nothing to do with the government's trying to protect an army or a draft or anything like that. So this one was allowed. Now, these are not required Supreme Court cases, but they're cases that lead up to others. And I want you to notice the difference between, say, F the draft and burning the flag, or O'Brien case versus Tinker, and see how they're different and why the court basically said different things at different times about the freedom of speech. So in O'Brien, the burning of the draft card was not allowed. The government had the right to support and raise an army. In Cohen versus California, with the T-shirt, F the draft, that was allowed because it didn't incite an illegal action. It didn't incite a riot. The clear and present danger was not used, and he was allowed to do that.